An arrogant millionaire wanted to impress his new girlfriend. He took her to a very fancy dinner. But when he saw his ex-wife working as a waitress, he turned the night into a cruel show. He said mean things and tried to humiliate her. But he didn't know the night would change in a way he never expected. Maison du Vent shimmered under the last light of the Los Angeles sunset. Its tall French doors welcomed in the golden glow through cream-colored silk drapes. This was the entrance of Beverly Hills' most exclusive restaurant. The valet adjusted his white gloves as a sleek black Rolls-Royce Ghost glided up the granite driveway. The granite was imported from the Swiss Alps. Carter Whitman, 48, stepped out of the car with absolute confidence. He wore a Brioni suit and a polished Audemars Piguet watch. He looked wealthy and powerful. He walked around to open the door for his date. "Welcome to LA's most exquisite restaurant, darling," he said with a smile. He offered his hand to Bianca Moore, 26. She looked dazzling in her emerald Dior gown. Bianca stepped out with the elegance of a runway star. Her heels clicked gently on the stone path. "Carter, you really know how to make an impression," she said, brushing back a wave of her glossy brunette hair. The maitre d' recognized Carter immediately and approached with enthusiasm. "Mr. Whitman, it's a pleasure to welcome you back. Your usual table awaits." The interior of Maison du Vent exuded beauty and sophistication. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm light over the ivory silk walls. Each table featured a vase of fresh white peonies. The soft notes of a grand piano filled the air. Glasses clinked in quiet rhythm with low conversations. "You can feel the eyes on us," Bianca whispered as they followed the maitre d'. "It's like royalty just walked in." Carter gave a proud smile. "In this world, status and presence are everything. And we define both." Their table was near a large window with a view of the courtyard garden. It offered just enough seclusion, yet still allowed curious eyes to catch glimpses. Perfect for being seen. A sommelier arrived with a wine list wrapped in soft Italian leather. "The Chateau Margaux 1983, please," Carter said, not bothering to glance up. "And use Zalto Denkart glasses. The standard ones won't do." As they waited for the wine, Carter looked over at Elise with visible pride. She was his newest trophy. Stunning, yes, but more importantly, she understood the game, and it was the game that truly fascinated him. Elise knew exactly how to move through a room, when to tilt her head just right, and how to smile in a way that drew every gaze toward her. "So, darling," Elise said, her gray eyes sharp with ambition and curiosity, "tell me more about that business acquisition you mentioned earlier. It must have been satisfying to wipe out the competition." Carter's grin deepened. "Ah yes, Broderick Partners. They never stood a chance. 18 years of deals, gone in 4 months. I dismantled them piece by piece. Old Broderick even had to auction his wine cellar." And then, the unexpected happened. A familiar silhouette stepped up to their table. She wore the signature uniform of Maison du Vent. Julia Bennett, 37, stood before them. Her posture was flawless, her expression serene, but inside, emotions clashed like thunder. For a breathless moment, everything froze. Carter, mid-story and riding high on his victory, suddenly stiffened. His eyes locked with Julia's, and for a brief flicker, his polished exterior slipped. "Good evening, I'm Julia, and I'll be your server tonight," she said evenly, though her pulse raced beneath her skin. Elise noticed the sudden change in Carter's tone. Her gaze darted between them, filled with curiosity. "Do you two know each other?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Julia is my ex-wife," Carter said, his smile returning, now colder, measured. "Well, isn't this something?" Julia, working the floor, quite the fall from grace. His words cut like a blade, but Julia stayed composed. "Would you like to hear tonight's specials?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Oh, this is just delightful," Elise said with a laugh, her eyes glinting with cruelty. "Carter, you never told me your ex had such versatile talents." The atmosphere grew heavy. A few nearby guests had begun to glance in their direction. Julia remained poised. Her fingers gripped her notepad a little tighter. For a brief second, her throat tightened. She could feel the heat rising to her face, not from embarrassment, but from the weight of old wounds reopening in public. A table near the bar had fallen silent, and she recognized one of the diners, a former colleague from her days in finance. Their eyes met, and though he quickly looked away, she knew the judgment had already formed. The humiliation wasn't just emotional, it now had a professional witness. "Our chef recommends the lobster risotto with black truffle tonight. It's been a guest favorite," she said, her voice calm and assured. "Of course," Carter interjected, sarcasm lacing his words. "You always did have expensive taste, didn't you, Jules? Though now, it looks like you're serving it instead of savoring it." Elise chuckled again, leaning forward so her diamond earrings caught the chandelier light. "Darling, don't be too harsh. I'm sure she's doing her best." Julia inhaled slowly, her eyes locked with Carter's, just for a heartbeat. "Shall I give you a moment to decide?" "Yes, please," Elise said sweetly. "And when you return, bring us an extra napkin, just in case things get messy." Julia turned and walked away with measured grace, her dignity intact, even as the heat of 100 stares followed her across the floor. In the kitchen, she leaned back against the cool wall and closed her eyes for a breath. "You okay?" asked Matteo, a young server who'd noticed the tension in her face. "I'm fine," Julia replied, standing tall again and adjusting her uniform collar. She had weathered worse. This was just another evening at Maison du Vent, even if her chest ached beneath her calm exterior. In the bustling kitchen, Matteo Ruiz kept a careful eye on Julia, his concern written across his young face. In his 3 years on the team, he had never seen her look so rattled. At 24, Matteo was the rising talent of the restaurant, son of Cuban immigrants, known for his sharp instincts and graceful service. "Julia, let me take over that table," he offered, his voice low and caring. "You don't need to put up with this." Julia's fingers brushed the delicate silver pin on her uniform, a small rose emblem, signifying her 5 years of dedicated service. Just beneath that pin, folded in her apron pocket, was a worn envelope, the latest medical bill for her mother's care. Few knew that Julia had been quietly juggling late-night shifts and early hospital visits for nearly a year. Her mother's condition was worsening, and the experimental treatment wasn't covered by insurance. "No, Matteo," she replied softly, steadying her breath. "There are some things we have to face ourselves." Just then, the restaurant manager approached. Daniel Quinn, tall and composed in a tailored Italian suit, was a master of elegant crisis control, measured, perceptive, unshakable. At 42, Daniel had seen it all in high-end hospitality. "Julia," he said, his tone steady, "Mr. Whitman is a VIP, but if he's making you uncomfortable—" "Everything's fine, Daniel," Julia interrupted gently. "I've got it handled." Meanwhile, back in the main dining area, Carter was relishing every moment of his little performance. He poured more Bordeaux into his glass, voice rising just enough to draw attention. "You know, Elise," he said, "Julia always chased status, but she never figured out how to play the game." He made sure the surrounding tables could hear. She thought charm and good manners were enough. Elise leaned closer, eyes glinting with playful cruelty. "Oh, darling," she purred, "tell me everything. How did you two even meet?" "Stanford Business School," Carter replied, slowly swirling his wine. "She was a secretary back then, always pushing for more, flirting with faculty, slipping into classes like she belonged." But the truth was far different. 12 years ago, Julia had been a top student on a full-ride scholarship. She earned her place with grit and intellect. Back then, Carter was nothing more than a pampered trust fund kid, drawn not just to her beauty, but to her sharp wit and unshakable determination. In the kitchen, Matteo carefully arranged the plates on a polished silver tray. He understood struggle all too well. Raised in a rough part of East LA, he juggled 3 jobs to afford his hospitality certifications. That's why he felt such empathy for Julia. He recognized the same resilience in her that burned in himself. "Do you know her story?" he asked Daniel, who was methodically inspecting each dish. Daniel sighed, his dark eyes reflecting something deeper. "All too well," he murmured. "Julia and Carter Whitman, it was the kind of scandal that stuck with Beverly Hills society. A few years ago, a scandal had rocked the elite. Back then, Carter was a rising star in luxury development. He used his wealth and influence to end his marriage to Julia in a ruthless fashion. It wasn't just heartbreak. He tore down her professional life too. Julia was one of the most promising market strategists in LA, Daniel said quietly. But Carter started a whisper campaign that she was involved in securities fraud. Of course, nothing was ever proven, he added, but in circles like ours, even a rumor can end a career. Julia returned to the table with the entrees. She placed a perfectly seared filet mignon before Carter and a rich lobster thermidor in front of Elise. Every gesture was precise, almost elegant, like choreography in a high-stakes ballet. "Your filet, sir," she said, her voice smooth. "And for the lady, the lobster." "Oh, Jules," Carter said with a smug grin. "Do you remember our nights at Melis's? You were obsessed with lobster, back when you could still afford the good stuff." Elise chuckled, slowly slicing into the lobster meat with exaggerated care. "Darling, don't be cruel," Elise said sweetly. "I'm sure she still reminisces about those glory days." They were baiting her, but Julia didn't flinch. Years navigating corporate boardrooms had taught her the power of restraint, how silence could be the strongest armor. In the kitchen, Matteo peeked through the swinging double doors. He clutched a folded towel in his fist, eyes locked on the unfolding scene. His own journey, filled with judgment and injustice, made him hypersensitive to power plays like this. "Es injusto," he muttered. "So unfair." Someone needed to say something. Daniel laid a steady hand on Matteo's shoulder. "Sometimes, Matteo," he said quietly, "the best revenge is composure. Watch and learn." The dinner felt like a staged humiliation. Every pause, every phrase from Carter and Elise was designed to diminish Julia, subtly but intentionally. And just as she leaned forward to pour Elise's second glass of wine, a light tremor rippled through her hand. A sudden, sharp ache had shot up her wrist. The old injury from years ago, never quite healed. It was something no one in the room knew about, a hidden reminder of the toll the past had taken. But she steadied herself. She'd trained for moments worse than this. Her jaw tightened slightly, but her smile didn't falter. They alternated between ignoring her completely or tossing out snide comments veiled as charm. "You know, Elise," Carter said as Julia refilled their wine, "I've always said humility is underrated. It's nice to see some people finally embrace it." The bottle quivered slightly in Julia's grip, but not a single drop was spilled. When her eyes briefly met Carter's, something flickered in his expression. It wasn't victory. It was confusion, because what he saw wasn't defeat. It was controlled resolve, calm strength, a quiet defiance he couldn't comprehend. Out on the floor, other staff had begun to pick up on the tension. Maria, a seasoned sommelier with an eagle eye for conflict, stepped beside Daniel. "He's pushing her on purpose," she said under her breath. "It's deliberate." Daniel gave a slow, firm nod. "Keep eyes on the table, Maria," he said, "and let the team know. Be alert. We can't afford a disruption." But the night only darkened. Emboldened by the wine and the ego boost, Elise started tossing out petty, senseless demands. "Oh, Jules, do you mind if I call you Jules?" Elise asked, her voice dripping with false charm. "This napkin has a fold. Could you bring a fresh one? And maybe make sure it's been properly pressed this time," she added, smiling sweetly, every word a veiled jab. From his station, Matteo watched, his jaw tightening with growing fury. "Daniel," he said in a hushed, urgent voice to the manager, "this is harassment. We can't just stand here." Before Daniel could respond, a figure quietly emerged from the private office at the back of Maison du Vin. Grant Bennett, the owner of the restaurant, had arrived for his customary evening walkthrough. Tall, poised, and exuding quiet authority, Grant scanned the dining room with eyes that missed nothing. His history with Julia was one of the establishment's most discreet confidences, shared only with Daniel and a select few on the senior staff. "Hold position, Matteo," Daniel said softly, watching as Grant moved closer. "Sometimes the universe knows exactly when to tip the scales." Out in the dining room, Carter lifted his wine glass. "To life, my dear Elise," he said with a smug grin, "and to the unexpected turns it brings." He had no clue the biggest twist of the evening was just around the corner. The energy in Maison du Vin had shifted. At a nearby table, an elderly couple exchanged uneasy glances. The woman shifted uncomfortably every time Carter or Elise directed another sly insult toward Julia. Back in the kitchen, Chef Alain, a towering Frenchman with a reputation forged in the world's most demanding kitchens, noticed the unusual quiet in his domain. The sous chefs moved stiffly, casting quick looks toward the dining room doors. "Qu'est-ce qui se passe?" he murmured under his breath, puzzled by the tension that hung over his usually lively kitchen like a cloud. Daniel walked over and quietly explained the situation. Chef Alain's face turned a deep shade of red. "Sacre bleu! In all my years, never." Julia asked to handle it herself, Daniel interrupted gently. Meanwhile, Matteo kept himself busy, but stayed within earshot of Carter's table. He'd mastered the art of being near difficult guests, close enough to intervene, but never intrusive. Born in East LA to a janitor and a bus mechanic, Matteo had long since learned how to navigate chaos with quiet resolve. "Courage," he murmured to Maria, watching Julia maintain her composure. "Where does she get it?" Maria, setting crystal wine glasses nearby, answered without looking up. "Some people wear dignity like armor," she said calmly. As the evening dragged on, memories seemed to fill the room like smoke, heavy, lingering. Carter, now tipsy from too much Bordeaux and his own arrogance, began sharing embellished stories from the past, each one carefully twisted to sting. "You know, Elise," he said loudly enough for Julia to hear, "our dear Jules once thought she could be a partner in my firm. Can you imagine? A scholarship girl from Stanford, thinking she could run with the big boys." Elise leaned closer, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Oh, darling, you have to tell me the rest. I bet it was adorable when she finally understood her place." But Carter's version was far from the truth. Julia had graduated top of her class at Stanford. At Carter's firm, she had masterminded some of their biggest deals. Her name had weight on the West Coast financial circuit, until the day Carter decided she was no longer an asset, but a threat. Daniel observed the entire scene, his mind drifting back to when Julia had first stepped into Maison du Vent 5 years earlier, quietly inquiring about a job. Though her career had collapsed under scandal, there was a quiet resilience about her that struck him immediately. "You're far too qualified for this role," he'd said to her at the time. "Sometimes," she had replied with a soft smile, "we rebuild, one brick at a time." Now, as he watched her confront her past with such unshakable dignity, Daniel finally understood why Grant had fallen for her. It was impossible not to respect someone who remained so true to herself, even while enduring so much. Back at the table, Carter kept the cruel commentary coming. "Elise, you should have seen her face when she realized all her contacts in finance had ghosted her. Hilarious how fast people vanish when they think you're damaged goods." Carter had orchestrated it all. He used his reach and influence to quietly poison Julia's reputation, planting whispers of insider trading that quickly killed her credibility and any hope of returning to the industry. Matteo approached to clear the first course. Hearing Carter's words made his chest tighten. Old wounds flared, memories of being overlooked, disrespected, treated as less. "Would you care for more wine, sir?" he asked evenly, swallowing the heat in his voice. "Certainly," Carter replied coolly, "and ensure it's the proper temperature. I assume even someone with your upbringing can manage that?" The venom in the words hit Matteo like a slap. Before he could respond, Daniel's hand landed gently on his shoulder, solid, grounding. The manager had appeared just in time. "I'll personally ensure the bottle is perfect, sir," Daniel said, composed. He guided Matteo away with quiet control. In the kitchen, Chef Alain was plating the next course with surgical precision. The tension hadn't escaped him. Beneath his calm surface, anger simmered, but he channeled every ounce of it into the perfection of the dish. Daniel observed the entire scene, his mind drifting back to when Julia had first stepped into Maison du Vent 5 years earlier, quietly inquiring about a job. Though her career had collapsed under scandal, there was a quiet resilience about her that struck him immediately. "You're far too qualified for this role," he'd said to her at the time. "Sometimes," she had replied with a soft smile, "we rebuild, one brick at a time." Now, as he watched her confront her past with such unshakable dignity, Daniel finally understood why Grant had fallen for her. It was impossible not to respect someone who remained so true to herself, even while enduring so much. Back at the table, Carter kept the cruel commentary coming. "Elise, you should have seen her face when she realized all her contacts in finance had ghosted her. Hilarious how fast people vanish when they think you're damaged goods." Carter had orchestrated it all. He used his reach and influence to quietly poison Julia's reputation, planting whispers of insider trading that quickly killed her credibility and any hope of returning to the industry. Matteo approached to clear the first course. Hearing Carter's words made his chest tighten. Old wounds flared, memories of being overlooked, disrespected, treated as less. "Would you care for more wine, sir?" he asked evenly, swallowing the heat in his voice. Certainly, Carter replied coolly, and ensure it's the proper temperature. I assume even someone with your upbringing can manage that? The venom in the words hit Mateo like a slap. Before he could respond, Daniel's hand landed gently on his shoulder. Solid, grounding. The manager had appeared just in time. I'll personally ensure the bottle is perfect, sir, Daniel said, composed. He guided Mateo away with quiet control. In the kitchen, Chef Alain was plating the next course with surgical precision. The tension hadn't escaped him. Beneath his calm surface, anger simmered, but he channeled every ounce of it into the perfection of the dish. Good evening, Grant said in a calm, resonant tone. I'm Grant Bennett, owner of Maison du Vent. I hope your evening has been enjoyable. Carter, still basking in his own arrogance, offered a lazy grin. Ah, the man behind the curtain. I must say, your establishment is adequate, he said, casting a dismissive glance at Julia. Though your hiring standards could use some reevaluation. Elise let out a theatrical laugh, casually brushing her fingers along her diamond pendant. Oh, darling, I'm sure Mr. Bennett appreciates honest criticism, especially from someone of your stature. Grant's smile remained in place, but his eyes sharpened with purpose. Actually, Mr. Whitman, he replied, I'm particularly interested in your comments about our staff, especially what you said regarding my wife. The room fell into an instant, stunned hush. Carter, mid-sip, froze with his glass half raised. Elise's eyes widened. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't conceal the sheer disbelief etched across her face. Your wife? Carter stammered. He looked between Grant and Julia, who now approached the table with composed elegance. Yes, Grant said, gently taking Julia's hand. She stood proudly at his side. Julia is not only my wife, but also the co-owner of Maison du Vent. She has been for the past 3 years. The revelation struck the room like lightning. An electric silence settled over the space. At nearby tables, longtime patrons exchanged knowing glances. Many had suspected. Others watched, frozen as the truth unfolded. That can't be, Elise muttered, her voice faltering. She's a server? Julia finally spoke, her tone calm and unwavering. I've worked through every level of this restaurant, Julia said. You can't lead what you haven't lived. Every station, every shift, it all matters. From his usual perch near the bar, Daniel watched it all unfold, a proud smile forming on his lips. He remembered the day Julia, already married to Grant, insisted on beginning as a floor server. She said she wanted to know the business inside out, not just on paper. Carter's expression shifted quickly. Shock, then disbelief, followed by anger and finally the realization. His entire performance had exposed only one thing, his own ignorance. This was staged, he said through clenched teeth. All of it. An act. No, Carter, Grant responded evenly, unshaken. You chose this venue. You chose to demean someone you assumed was below you. Everything tonight, that's on you. Back in the kitchen, the staff had stopped moving. From behind the swinging doors, they silently watched. Mateo's throat tightened as the truth hit him. His role model wasn't a server. She was the owner. She's Reina, he whispered to Maria, using a term of reverence in Spanish. Maria nodded, visibly moved. Elise, her face pale and composed cracking, started gathering her handbag and shawl. Carter, darling, I think it's time to go, she murmured, but Grant raised a hand with cool command. Please, stay. Your main course is still on the way. It would be disrespectful to the kitchen's efforts to leave now. Then his smile sharpened just slightly. And besides, we still have much to discuss about accountability and consequences. The words struck Carter hard. He didn't need them spelled out. He knew exactly what Grant was referring to, the slander he had spread about Julia, the whispers that had torched her career in finance. You don't have the right, Carter began, but the words caught in his throat as Grant's unblinking stare met his. Can't what, Mr. Whitman? Grant asked. Tell the financial community how you dismantled the reputation of a brilliant strategist with lies. Or maybe explain a few questionable practices your firm has been tied to in recent years. Carter's complexion drained of color. In that moment, it hit him. Grant Bennett wasn't just a restaurant owner. He was one of the most influential investors on the West Coast, with deeper connections than Carter had ever imagined. Julia, who had remained composed through the entire exchange, finally spoke. You know, Carter, she said softly, if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Real success isn't about tearing people down. It's about building something that lasts, something that lifts others. Her voice carried no bitterness, only clarity. It came from growth that no amount of money could manufacture. She glanced around the dining room, at her staff, her chosen family, at the guests who now saw her for who she really was, not just a co-owner, but a woman of conviction. This restaurant, Julia continued, isn't just a business. It's a home. A home for remarkable people who show up every day to create joy for others. People like Matteo, who worked 3 jobs to pursue his dream. Like Maria, who raised 3 children on her own and still became one of the top sommeliers in the city. Like Chef Alain, who crafts every plate as if it were his last masterpiece. Her words hung in the air, echoing with quiet power. Elise, who only moments before had been brimming with arrogance, now shifted uneasily in her seat. Her manicured fingers tapped nervously on her designer clutch. "Carter," she whispered, leaning close. "We need to go. This is too much." But Carter remained still, paralyzed. His pride, his dominance, all the control he thought he had, it was slipping through his fingers. He had tried to humiliate Julia. But what he saw now wasn't a woman who had been defeated. It was a woman who had transcended. Grant stood beside her, calm and commanding. With a subtle nod, he turned to Daniel. Daniel stepped forward, a bill in hand, and his expression perfectly composed. "Your check for the evening, Mr. Whitman," he said with polished formality, "including the Chateau Marmargot 1983. Carter glanced down, his eyes widened at the figure. On any other night, it would have been nothing. But tonight, each extra zero landed like a punch to his pride. "Allow me," Grant said smoothly, stepping in. "Let's add something special." He picked up the bill and scribbled something on the back. "My personal card," he explained, handing it to Carter, "and a list of a few mutual acquaintances on the West Coast investment circuit. I imagine they'd be very interested in what really happened 5 years ago." Carter's pale expression turned ashen. "You wouldn't dare." "Wouldn't I?" Grant raised one eyebrow, unshaken. "Call it a reminder, Mr. Whitman. Every action leaves a ripple, and the universe, it tends to settle its debts." At surrounding tables, longtime guests looked on, some smiling quietly. They had long respected Julia, admired her elegance. Few knew she co-owned the restaurant. In the kitchen doorway, Matteo stood tall, watching the scene with pride. To him, Julia had always been more than a leader. She was proof that grace and resolve could triumph over cruelty. "Let's go," Elise pleaded, tugging at Carter's sleeve. Her air of control had crumbled into desperation. "This is humiliating." Carter rose, but barely. His steps were heavy, unsteady. The confidence, the ego, it had all drained away. He looked nothing like the man who walked in earlier, and as they turned to leave, Julia spoke once more. Her voice was steady, but laced with undeniable strength. "Oh, and Carter," Julia said, her tone even, "about that deal you mentioned with Denham and Associates, I reversed it last week. Old Denham will have his Malibu estate back before the month's end." It was the final blow. Carter swayed slightly, one hand reaching for the table to steady himself. His proudest business maneuver, the one he had bragged about so confidently just minutes ago, had been unraveled behind his back. "How?" he managed. Grant gave a calm smile. "Well," he said, "some people on the street still recognize true expertise when they see it. And my wife happens to be exceptionally gifted at uncovering irregularities in corporate acquisitions." The couple left in silence. Elise nearly had to pull Carter toward the exit. Her heels echoed against the marble flooring, each step like a gavel sounding the end of their little empire. As the front doors shut behind them, something shifted in Maison Duval. The oppressive tension lifted, replaced by a quiet, comforting sense of justice. Chef Alain emerged from the kitchen, his usually stoic face glowing with pride. "Madame Julia," he called out in his thick French accent, "tonight we celebrate." The staff gathered, eyes filled with joy, respect, and admiration. Daniel raised a glass of sparkling water. "To perseverance," he said with warmth, "and to Julia, our partner, our guide, and the soul of Maison Duval." Applause followed, not loud but sincere. It flowed together with the gentle return of the piano music, soothing and proud. Julia's eyes glistened as she looked around the room, at her team, her chosen family, built not on fear or force, but on integrity and care. She lifted her glass, full of gratitude, and smiled. "This isn't just my victory," Julia said, her voice steady and full of warmth. "It's proof that no matter how far we're pushed down, we can rise." Thank you, all of you, for standing with me." The celebration unfolded in the graceful, understated style that defined Maison du Vent. Plates left the kitchen with renewed energy. Laughter returned to the space. Julia stood beside Grant, their hands quietly clasped. Together, they had faced down the past and emerged stronger. Maison du Vent was no longer just a restaurant. It had become a testament to resilience, character, and the quiet power of doing the right thing. The next morning, Maison du Vent opened as always, but something was different. The new energy hummed beneath the surface. Word had already traveled fast across Beverly Hills. Julia's story was being called a victory of truth and redemption. She arrived early as usual. The restaurant was still and bathed in soft morning light. As she walked between the tables, her fingertips brushed across crisp linen. She inhaled the calm scent of flowers and freshly polished wood. "Good morning, love," Grant said as he stepped out from his office, holding 2 steaming cups of Italian espresso. It was their quiet ritual, just a few moments of peace before the pace of the day. They stood in silence for a moment. "About last night," Julia began, accepting her cup with a grateful smile. "You were brilliant," Grant said gently, cutting in. "But something tells me this is only the beginning." And he was right. By mid-morning, 3 major food and lifestyle magazines had already reached out, eager to spotlight the woman behind Maison du Vent, her journey. And the night justice walked right through the front door. The Los Angeles Times called, Daniel reported as he checked his tablet. "They're planning a feature titled, 'Let's See. Redefining Leadership in Fine Dining, How a Former Financial Strategist is Transforming the Restaurant Industry.'" Julia chuckled quietly. "Transforming? I'm just treating people the way they should have always been treated." Still, her approach stood out. By working every position from server to wine steward, she had developed a deep, personal understanding of each role. That insight led to a uniquely thoughtful way of managing the restaurant, and a team that functioned in true harmony. Later that morning, Matteo arrived for his shift. He found Julia in the kitchen alongside Chef Alan, inspecting crates of heirloom vegetables delivered by local farmers. The young waiter was still processing everything that had unfolded the night before. "Signora Julia," he said quietly, almost in awe, "I always knew there was something different about you. But I never imagined." "Matteo," she cut in gently, smiling, "I'm still the same woman who showed you how to fold napkins and hold a tray without spilling." But some things had changed. She hadn't slept much. The sudden wave of attention, from media calls to unexpected investor pitches, had left her desk buried in emails, and her mind running on fumes. A soft headache throbbed behind her eyes, and for a brief moment, while lifting a crate of produce, she felt a dizzy spell. She quickly steadied herself, placing the box down with controlled care. No one seemed to notice, but inside, Julia knew she was running close to empty. Now that the world knew who she really was, the attention came fast. Journalists were requesting interviews. Investors were asking to franchise the Maison du Vent model in Paris, London, Tokyo. "The world's watching," Grant said during a strategy session. "Everyone wants to understand what we're doing here." Julia listened, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She thought of Maria, who had just enrolled in her first official sommelier course. Because of Julia's encouragement, she thought of Matteo, whose natural instincts for service just needed nurturing. "Before we talk about growing outward," she said, "I want to grow inward. Let's start a development program, scholarships for our staff, training, exchanges with other great kitchens." Grant nodded, admiring the clarity in her voice. In that moment, he saw again the same quiet conviction that first made him believe in her. "Always putting others first," he said, his smile full of pride. "It's not kindness," Julia replied with a knowing smile. "It's an investment. The real power of any business lies in the people who make it work." In the weeks that followed, Julia found herself navigating a new kind of challenge: how to balance her now public status with the quiet humility that had always defined her approach. Some guests, upon realizing that the server was actually the co-owner, reacted with surprise. Mrs. Bennett, one loyal diner, gasped as she saw Julia refilling a water glass. "Please, just call me Julia," she replied warmly. "Yes, I still do this. This is who I am." But with the media came another wave of attention. Reporters tried to twist her story into a revenge narrative against Carter. But Julia steered clear of that path. Instead, she used every interview to focus on what truly mattered, cultivating a workplace rooted in mutual respect, personal development, and integrity. In a widely shared article in Gastronom Weekly, she said, "Success isn't about beating someone else. It's about staying true to your values and helping others rise with you." The quote took on a life of its own. Julia was now seen not just as a force in fine dining, but as a symbol of ethical leadership, quiet resilience, and grace under pressure. With time, her story began to influence others, her staff, her peers, even other establishments. Across Los Angeles, restaurateurs began rethinking how they treated their employees. The idea that elegance could walk hand in hand with warmth and humanity was reshaping the dining scene. Then one afternoon, as Julia led a training session for a new group of staff, her phone rang with an unexpected call. It was Denham, the executive whose firm she had discreetly helped restore. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice heavy with sincerity, "I don't know how to thank you. What you did, it wasn't just business. It gave me back my dignity." That phone call marked the start of something entirely new. Deeply moved, Denham invited Julia to lunch at Maison du Vent to share an idea. "Let's start an investment fund," he proposed. "For small business owners, people who've been steamrolled by corporate giants. Think of how many Julias out there just need someone to believe in them again." The idea touched something deep inside her. Julia often thought late into the night about others who'd been crushed by greed and power, left behind without a voice. "I can't walk away from this place," she said quietly. "This restaurant, these people, they're my family." "Who said anything about walking away?" Denham grinned. Maison du Vent can be the case study, the proof that good business doesn't require bad behavior. The vision was bold. Running the restaurant while launching a philanthropic investment initiative would demand new levels of leadership. But Julia had learned, the hardest challenges often led to the most meaningful growth. At their next team meeting, she gathered her core staff. She outlined a more collaborative leadership model. Daniel would become general manager, assuming broader responsibilities. Mateo, with his natural teaching ability, would lead a new in-house development initiative. "You're not just my team," Julia told them, her voice steady and full of trust. "You're my partners. You all have the power to lead and to lift others." Maria, who had just earned her sommelier certification, was the first to respond. "You taught us that dignity isn't something that can be taken," she said softly. "It multiplies when we give it to others." Chef Alain, usually composed and soft-spoken, blinked away a tear. "Madame," he said with heartfelt reverence, "this place is more than a dining room. You've made it sacred." Julia's journey, from a woman silenced and betrayed to a mentor and forceful leader, was gaining national attention. Invitations to speak at business schools began arriving steadily. But students weren't just interested in how she overcame Carter's betrayal. They wanted to hear about her values, her people-first approach to leadership. At a special guest lecture at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, Julia came full circle. She stood at the podium in a hall much like the one where her career had started. In the front row sat a young woman who reminded her of herself 15 years ago. Brilliant, determined, and still trying to find her voice in an unforgiving world. "Real success," Julia said, locking eyes with the student, "isn't about how many you outpace. It's about how many you bring with you." But even as she spoke, a flicker of unease tugged at the edge of her thoughts. The memories were still fresh. Carter's betrayal, the lies, the days she had spent doubting her own worth. As the audience applauded, Julia's hand briefly trembled at her side. She forced a deep breath and smiled, but inside she still carried the echo of those darker moments. Healing was not a switch, it was a process. The talk evolved into something deeper. Students began sharing stories of inequity and silent struggle. Professors reconsidered long-held assumptions about business education. Julia's message, one of strength through compassion, resonated far beyond the campus. Her story was no longer just a redemption arc. It became a model of leadership grounded in empathy, truth, and purpose. 6 months after the unforgettable night at Maison du Vent, the restaurant had become more than just a fine dining landmark. It was now a cultural symbol. Reservations were booked months in advance. Guests came not only for the cuisine, but for the atmosphere of dignity, warmth, and shared respect that filled every corner. One hectic evening, Matteo burst into Giulia's office, clearly alarmed. "Signora, you need to see this." On his tablet was a breaking Los Angeles Times headline: "Whitman Holdings on the verge of collapse." Carter Whitman was now under federal investigation for securities fraud and market manipulation. The probe had begun after several anonymous whistleblowers came forward, exposing irregularities in his mergers and acquisitions. Grant entered the room quietly, holding 2 glasses of wine. "This wasn't you, was it?" he asked softly. Giulia shook her head. "Not directly, but when we helped Denham reclaim his company, a few discrepancies surfaced." Just then the phone rang. Daniel's voice came through, tight with tension. "Carter's here," he said, "and he brought attorneys." The mood in the office shifted instantly. This wasn't the arrogant Carter Whitman from half a year ago. This was a man unraveling, cornered and stripped of the power he once wielded. "Should I call security?" Matteo asked, instinctively balling his hands into fists. "No," Giulia said evenly, rising from her chair. "Some conversations are meant to be heard." In the dining room, Carter sat at a secluded table toward the back. 2 sharply dressed lawyers flanked him. His face was sunken, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. Though his tailored Armani suit clung perfectly to his frame, it hung on him like a burden. "Giulia," he said as she approached. His voice was quiet, no arrogance, only exhaustion. "We need to talk." "I'm listening," she said, sitting across from him with the same poised calm she had once shown while serving tables. "You've won," Carter admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "My company's unraveling. My name means nothing now. Even Elise." He gave a hollow laugh. "She's moved on, found someone more promising." One of the lawyers cleared his throat and gently pushed a folder across the table. "Mrs. Bennett, our client is prepared to make a significant offer, conditional on your cooperation regarding some sensitive legal matters." Giulia didn't even glance at the folder. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said. "What?" Carter asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "This was never about revenge," Giulia said calmly. "It wasn't about ruining you or dismantling Whitman Holdings. It was about justice, about setting things right. Not just for me, but for everyone you've trampled." Around the dining room, conversations fell quiet. Guests sensed something profound was unfolding. From the kitchen doorway, Chef Alain stood silently, a chef's knife resting in one hand, not in threat, but in quiet solidarity. "What do you want from me?" Carter asked, his voice brittle. Giulia leaned forward slightly, her eyes unwavering. "I want you to understand something essential," she said. "Power isn't about control or intimidation. It's about how many people you uplift, not how many you bury." Just then, the front doors opened. Denham entered, followed by several more figures, individuals Carter had once silenced or outmaneuvered for gain. "How appropriate," Giulia said with a subtle smile. "Let me reintroduce you to a few people from your past." Denham stepped forward, collected and calm, a mirror of the strength Carter had lost. "Whitman," he said. "Long time." "What is this?" Carter asked, his gaze jittery. "A setup?" "No," Giulia replied, firm but composed. "An opportunity for redemption." Daniel stepped forward and placed a thick file on the table, much more substantial than the one Carter's lawyers had slid forward earlier. "This," Giulia said evenly, "is a proposal to restructure Whitman Holdings. Not to dismantle it, but to rebuild it into something meaningful." "You expect me to hand over my company?" Carter asked, stunned. "No," Giulia replied. "We want you to rebuild it, with us." Denham stepped forward. "The investment initiative Giulia and I created isn't just about rescuing failing companies," he said. "It's about redefining how we do business." Carter slowly opened the folder. He flipped through its thick pages. The content was precise. Detailed strategies for ethical leadership, rebuilding credibility, and creating authentic, long-term value. In Carter's hands wasn't just a plan, it was a blueprint for redemption. "This was never about punishing you, Carter," Giulia said, her voice steady. "It's about showing that even the most broken companies, like people, can be rebuilt if there's genuine intent to do better." The impact of her words began to register. Carter scanned the room, seeing the faces of those he had wronged and those now offering him an unlikely second chance. Something unfamiliar stirred in him. Hope. His lawyers looked at each other with cautious uncertainty. This wasn't the ambush they feared. It was an opening. A reset. Let me get this straight, Carter said carefully, turning a few more pages. You're suggesting Whitman Holdings become some kind of support engine for small businesses? More than that, Denham replied, pulling up a chair. We want to use your expertise, your experience in mergers, not to devour businesses, but to help them scale. The dining room had transformed into an impromptu strategy session. Mateo silently placed a tray of fresh coffee at the table. Chef Alain stood quietly nearby, no longer tense, but still watching with careful pride. And why should I agree to this? Carter asked. His voice lacked hostility now. It was curiosity. Julia leaned forward slightly, her voice unwavering. Because deep down you're exhausted, tired of fighting, tired of manipulating, tired of tearing things down. This is your opportunity to build, to rewrite your legacy. The words landed heavily. For the first time in his career, Carter wasn't being offered a win or a loss. He was being offered a transformation. The federal case, he began cautiously. We've already spoken with the investigators, Denham replied. If you cooperate fully and commit to the changes, they're willing to consider a settlement. At that moment, Maria stepped forward holding a familiar bottle, the Chateau Lafite Rothschild, 1982. The same vintage Carter had ordered half a year ago. To fresh starts, she said quietly, pouring it into crystal glasses with the practiced grace of a certified sommelier. But as the wine flowed, Julia felt a wave of unease. The scent of that vintage transported her back to that humiliating night when Carter and Elise mocked her in front of a dining room full of strangers. The sting of those moments hadn't entirely faded, and for a brief second, her grip on the glass faltered. She steadied herself, forcing the memory to dissolve into the background, reminding herself that grace sometimes required holding space for pain. Grant, who had remained silent as everything unfolded, finally spoke. You know, Carter, he said, when I met Julia, she could have chosen revenge. She had every reason to. But she chose something far greater. Soft piano music drifted from the corner of the room, and guests who had been quietly observing now watched with reverence. They sensed history being made. Carter's voice cracked. How do I know I can trust any of you? Julia met his gaze. The same way we're choosing to trust you, she answered gently. With structure, with oversight, but with hope. One of Carter's attorneys leaned in, whispering into his ear after reviewing the plan. Carter nodded slowly, eyes never leaving Julia. Why? He asked at last, the question raw and uncertain. Why would you give me this chance, after everything I did? Julia raised her glass and replied, because someone once believed in me when I had nothing. And real change? It goes both ways. The room fell into a quiet stillness, and then from across the floor came a sharp clatter. Mateo had dropped an empty tray, visibly moved by what had just transpired. Sorry, Mateo mumbled, his cheeks flushing red. The simple human moment eased the tension at the table. Quiet smiles spread among those gathered. Even Carter allowed himself a small, unguarded smile, the first sincere one in many months. And what if I fail? He asked, voice low, almost vulnerable. Then you'll have failed doing something that finally mattered, Denham replied gently. In that instant, Maison du Vent became the stage for something rare, something sacred. A man who had once defined himself by dominance and control was now being offered a chance worth far more than wealth, a real second chance. Before you decide, Julia said softly, reaching into her folder once more, there's one more thing you should see. She slid a document across the table. It was a list. Dozens of names, companies, people. Each one linked to a story of loss, of someone Carter had hurt through ruthless business tactics. But beside every name was a strategy, a plan to help them recover. This, Julia said, is where the real change begins. It's not just about restructuring your company. It's about repairing what's been broken, one business, one family, one name at a time. Carter stared at the sheet, eyes moving slowly across the names. He remembered every single one. Each was a decision made in pursuit of gain. Now they stared back at him, not as numbers, but as consequences. How long? He asked hoarsely. The corporate side? Denham answered, 2 years, maybe less. Redemption? Carter looked at Julia. She met his gaze with steady calm. That, she said, is up to you. Carter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his Mont Blanc pen, the one he had used to sign deals, mergers and takeovers. But tonight it was for something very different. Gentlemen, he said to his lawyers, I won't be needing your counsel this evening." The attorney stood and left, visibly displeased. Chef Alam finally set his knife down and allowed himself a small, contented smile. When Carter signed the agreement, it wasn't a strategic play. It was a transformation. A surrender not born of defeat, but of clarity. A choice to find strength not through control, but through change. "Welcome to the right side of history," Julia said, lifting her glass. Maison du Vent, silent witness to countless whispered deals and social games, had just hosted its most profound turning point. Not a tale of revenge, but one of redemption. A story where empathy outshone ego. 1 year later, Maison du Vent had evolved far beyond its reputation as an elite dining destination. It had become a symbol, proof that grace, resilience, and accountability could coexist at the highest levels of business. And it all started with one woman, one evening, and the decision to lead with dignity instead of bitterness. The ripple effect was being felt throughout the industry. On one especially busy morning, Matteo stood before a room of newly hired staff. Now the director of professional growth, he had turned his rise, from hardship to leadership, into inspiration. "Always remember," he told the group, "every position here is a leadership role. Every action you take is a chance to impact someone's life." Not far away, Maria moved with precision and grace among the tables. Now head sommelier, she wore her title with pride. Her 3 daughters had all earned full scholarships, thanks to the educational fund Julia and Grant had established. "Mom," her eldest had once said, "when I grow up, I want to be like Signora Julia." Maria had smiled through tears. "No, mija," she whispered, pulling her daughter close. "Be you. That's the greatest thing Julia ever taught us." In the kitchen, Chef Alain remained the undisputed master of his realm, but now with an even bigger heart. He had launched an apprenticeship initiative for young talents from underserved neighborhoods. His fiery energy had softened over time, though he still brandished his favorite knife with theatrical flair when making a point. "La cuisine," he liked to say, "is a democracy. Here, only skill and effort decide who you are." Logan, now the general manager, had implemented smart management systems, so effective they were being reviewed in case studies by top business schools. The Maison du Vent model was fast becoming a benchmark for how excellence and compassion could thrive together. And Carter Whitman, his transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Under a new code of values and leadership, Whitman Holdings had become a model for responsible business. The path had been full of self-doubt and hard lessons, but the outcomes were undeniable. "There are still hard days," Carter admitted during one of his regular check-ins at the restaurant. "Habits built on ego don't go away overnight, but we're moving forward." The company had evolved into a launchpad for ethical businesses, especially those led by entrepreneurs from marginalized backgrounds. The investment initiative started by Julia and Denham was helping change lives, one idea, one dream, one business at a time. As for Alexandra, she had disappeared from Beverly Hills elite circles. Some said she'd moved to Santa Monica and was writing a memoir. Few, however, were eager to read her version of the story. One evening, Maison du Vent hosted a special celebration. Julia stood quietly at the edge of the softly lit dining room, absorbing the joy and connection that filled the space. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a living example of purpose, compassion, and growth. "Penny for your thoughts?" Grant asked gently, joining her with 2 glasses of champagne. "I was just thinking," she replied, smiling as she accepted the glass, "how unpredictable life can be. 6 years ago, when you gave me that first job on the floor, I wasn't just broke, I was broken. And now look at you," Grant said proudly. "A force of nature," Grant said softly, watching Julia. She smiled. Laughter from the kitchen drifted over. Chef Alain was coaching a group of apprentices on the delicate balance of his signature hollandaise. Through the swinging doors, they could glimpse Matteo demonstrating wine service with quiet elegance. Each gesture was confident, refined by years of hands-on experience. At his usual spot, Denham sat with Carter. They were deep in discussion, sketching out plans for their newest initiative aimed at uplifting struggling small businesses. Carter looked different now. His eyes no longer held the edge of ambition unchecked, but something more grounded, thoughtful. "You know," Julia said, scanning the dining room, "sometimes I wonder if this is all just too good to be true. Like you'll wake up, Grant replied, finishing her thought with familiarity. And it'll all have been a dream? She nodded. Exactly. Grant gently took her hand. Well, he said, if it is a dream, then it's one worth recreating. Every single day. All around them, the soft sound of silverware, laughter, and sincere conversation created something special. A harmony of renewal. Maison du Vent was no longer just a restaurant. It had become proof that resilience, decency, and purpose weren't just ideas, they were tools for transformation. Just then, Logan approached, eyes a little glossy, tablet in hand. Julia, he said, his voice catching. You need to see this. On the screen was a glowing headline from the New York Times. Maison du Vent named Restaurant of the Year, a beacon of social change. The article went beyond cuisine. It celebrated how the restaurant had become a driver of cultural renewal through mentorship, equity, and meaningful leadership that put people first. Grant turned to Julia, his voice filled with quiet awe. Seems it's not a dream after all. Around the room, more success stories continued to unfold. Maria had been invited to teach at the wine academy where she once trained. Matteo was building a mentorship program for immigrant youth eager to break into the hospitality world. Chef Alain had finally agreed to publish his first cookbook, pledging all profits to Maison du Vent's education fund. Even Julia's old critics had begun to acknowledge her impact. Her leadership approach, now referred to as the Bennett method, was being incorporated into business school curricula, celebrated as a framework for building ethical, resilient organizations. You've created something extraordinary, Denham said, standing beside her. Something far bigger than food or business. Carter nodded beside him, a quiet, humbled agreement. You showed me that leadership isn't about power, he said. It's about purpose. A gentle clinking of glasses turned heads across the dining room. Logan had stepped onto a small platform, a microphone in hand. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice filled with emotion. Tonight isn't just another dinner at Maison du Vent. Tonight, we mark 1 year since our true journey began. The guests, many of them longtime patrons who had witnessed the restaurant's evolution, erupted into applause. Julia blinked back tears, taking in the room full of people she now called family. But Logan wasn't finished. There's one more surprise, he said, with a playful twinkle in his eye. Grant leaned in and squeezed Julia's hand gently. His eyes shone with quiet excitement. She could tell something big was coming. Ladies and gentlemen, Logan continued as the room hushed again, it's my honor to announce that Maison du Vent is about to begin its most ambitious chapter yet. Grant stepped up beside him. His voice was calm and firm. For years, this restaurant has been more than just a place to eat. It has become a beacon of hope and transformation. And now, we are expanding that vision in a way no one could have imagined. Julia's eyes widened as several familiar faces emerged from the crowd. Former professors and mentors from her Harvard days. People who had once believed in her when the rest of the world turned its back. The Maison du Vent Institute of Culinary Arts and Ethical Leadership, Grant announced proudly, as the presentation screen lit up behind him, will be the first school in the world to combine elite culinary education with human-centered business practices. It was an ambitious vision. The building next door would become a groundbreaking school. Students would learn from masters. Chef Alain would teach gastronomy, Matteo would lead service excellence, while Julia and Denham would teach ethical leadership and responsible business strategy. Then Maria stepped forward, her eyes glistening. The best part, she said with emotion, 70% of seats will be reserved for students from underserved communities, with full scholarships. The room went quiet. Then Carter stood up, his voice steady and strong, clearer than it had been all evening. Reynolds Industries is proud to be the founding sponsor of the scholarship program. The dining room erupted in applause. Matteo and Maria embraced tearfully. Chef Alain raised his knife in the air, grinning through tears. Grant faced the room again, his gaze locked on Julia. But there's one more thing, he said with a meaningful smile. You're not just opening a school, you're igniting a movement. The screen shifted once more, showing glowing stars on cities across the globe. Paris, Tokyo, São Paulo, Cape Town, London. In each of these cities, he said, a Maison du Vent Institute is being planned, each one tailored to its culture, but all rooted in the same principles: dignity, mastery, and transformation. Julia stepped up to the podium, the room falling into a respectful hush once more. Sometimes, she said, her voice steady and heartfelt, the universe has a funny way of working. It takes our worst defeats and turns them into our greatest opportunities. To make a difference, Julia scanned the room, taking in the faces that had walked this journey with her. Grant, her steadfast and loving partner. Mateo, the embodiment of grit and persistence. Maria, the picture of loyalty and quiet strength. Chef Alain, the heartbeat of the kitchen and living proof that passion breeds change. Logan, the silent pillar who had trusted her from day one. And even Carter, once her greatest rival, now proof that redemption is real. Maison du Vent had never just been about luxurious food. It was always about something more. It's about believing, Julia thought, that everyone deserves a chance to rewrite their own story of redemption. And now, we'll help others do just that. The clinking of glasses echoed again, but above it came something stronger. The quiet rise of hope, of possibilities being born, of lives finding new paths. Because the most powerful stories aren't always about revenge. They're about transformation. Stories that evolve, expand, and lift others along the way. And here in the heart of Beverly Hills, in a restaurant that had become a living symbol of renewal, a new chapter was beginning. In a world where revenge feels easy, Julia chose something far greater. She turned pain into purpose, brokenness into building blocks, her past into a bridge for others. So here we are, dear friends, at the end of a story that wasn't just about humiliation but healing. And if you're still with us at this point, then maybe, just maybe, something in this tale has stirred your heart too. Maybe you recognized yourself in Julia. Maybe you felt the sting of injustice, the weight of being underestimated, or the quiet fire of choosing grace over vengeance. What Julia teaches us is this: strength is not in retaliation, but in restoration. In a world obsessed with winning, she chose to rebuild. As the Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Julia reacted not with anger, but with purpose. She could have crushed Carter, but instead, she offered him something far more powerful than defeat, a chance to transform. That is leadership. That is legacy. Seneca reminded us, sometimes even to live is an act of courage. Julia didn't just live. She lifted others while rebuilding her own life. And through that choice, she didn't just change her destiny. She became a guidepost for everyone watching. So now, let's turn this story into a mirror for ourselves. What will you choose when the world hands you pain? Will you hold on to it or turn it into something meaningful? If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe for more stories that reflect our deepest truths and highest aspirations. And in the comments, tell us, what does redemption mean to you? Let's make this not just the end of a story, but the start of a beautiful conversation.